Today's video is another compilation of some of the worst mountaineering tragedies that I've covered on this channel, from Everest's most challenging climb to a recap of the 2023 climbing season on Everest and Annapurna 1. We cover it all. If you enjoy this type of content, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button, and as always, viewer discretion is advised. Nobody is safe in mountaineering, especially on a mountain like Everest. You can be regarded as some of the best climbers of your time, have an incredible knack to balance safety and risk, but above 8,000 meters, sometimes it just doesn't matter. This is the reality of a peak such as Everest, and the cold hard truth that Peter Boardman and Joe Tasker would face. This is their story. In the 1970s, Joe Tasker and Peter Boardman accomplished more than most of us could even dream of, and were regarded as two of the greatest British climbers ever. But both of their stories are unique and started well before the 1970s. Joe was born as the eldest son of a strong Catholic family in 1948, and after obtaining a degree in sociology at Manchester University, he decided not to enter the career field, but instead commit his free time to climbing. His early mountaineering days were largely spent in the Alps, where he climbed a number of demanding routes with another accomplished mountaineer, Dick Renshaw. In 1974 and 1975, they would take on the north face of the Eiger, one of the most intimidating and impressive walls in the world. Then following that up with the second ascent of the rarely climbed east face of the Grand Joras. In 1975, Joe would first experience the Himalayas, and after Dunnagiri in 1976, he conceived a ridiculous idea of climbing the west wall of Changabang with none other than Peter Boardman. While Pete was just 2 years younger than Joe, his climbing career had started later. In 1972, he would attempt his first climb, and in 1975, he would be part of the Everest South Face expedition. He had a natural talent, and because he showed that he was one of the strongest climbers of the expedition, he would be invited back for a second attempt and reach the summit of the world's tallest peak on September 26, 1975. After a few more impressive climbs, he would find himself joining Joe Tasker in 1976 on the west wall of Changabang, and they would become the first climbers to conquer that wall. They would climb the wall as a duo with no Sherpa support. This accomplishment was a breakthrough of gigantic proportions in Himalayan climbing at the time. Pete would write a book called The Shining Mountain, and it would become one of the most successful mountaineering books ever. To this day, it is considered a must-read for anyone interested in the sport. Pete and Joe would go on to climb together on many expeditions over the next few years, such as the North Ridge of Nuptse, K2, Kanchenjunga, and even becoming the first to summit an unclimbed mountain in western China, Mount Conger. Not every expedition was successful though, as they never reached the summit of K2 or Nuptse, but the pair had established themselves as prolific climbers, which is exactly why when the northeast ridge of Everest was discussed as a potential climb, the pair was chosen. The entire expedition would be made up of 6 members, 4 main climbers, Joe and Pete, along with Dick Renshaw and the expedition leader Chris Bonington, and 2 support climbers, Charlie Clark and Adrian Gordon. There was no Sherpa support, as they desired the attempt to be lightweight and quick for the small team. They would also be making the attempt without supplementary oxygen. The Northeast Ridge had never been climbed in 1982, and it was regarded as one of the longest unsolved challenges in high-level mountaineering for many years. It is hard to describe the difficulty of the route, but I will do my best. I believe the pictures are the only way to truly understand the madness of this climb. The first Pinnacles base lies at 7,800 meters, but extends into the death zone, where the oxygen is a third of what it is at sea level. Before declining to the base of the second pinnacle, you have to climb through a mixture of rock and snow, through a 60-degree gully before following the crest of the ridge on a knife's edge before reaching the top. You then descend a dangerous rocky slope, where one wrong step could send you tumbling thousands of feet down the mountain. Congratulations, you survived the first pinnacle. The other 2 are only steeper, less stable, have even thinner ridges, and further into the death zone, with the third pinnacle being a series of ascents and descents through the nearly vertical rock faces. Oh, and when you finish the third pinnacle, you still have a couple hundred meters before reaching the summit, and one more challenge. the 3 steps of Everest. To anyone climbing the north route, this would be the hardest challenge of the climb, much less if you just pass the 3 pinnacles and are utterly exhausted. This is why nobody even thought the route could be fully completed. Just maybe someone could conquer the 3 pinnacles, but surely they would be too exhausted to continue climbing, much less take on another difficult challenge well above 8,000 meters. The team would arrive at Everest's North Base Camp in March of 1982, traveling through Tibet, and they would take a slow approach to climbing the mountain, as it was essential for the acclimatization process. They established the advanced base camp at 6,200 meters on the East Rongbuk Glacier on April 4th. In a biting cold and penetrating wind, they would push the route forward, establishing 3 snow hole camps, the highest at 7,850 meters, just below the first pinnacle. Chris would state that the climbing to this point was not difficult, but the length of the ridge, altitude, the remorseless wind, and the lack of a fixed rope all combined to make it a grueling experience. The plan was to get the route established to the top of the first pinnacle as a jumping off point for an alpine-style dash for the summit. But while fixing rope up to this point, Dick Renshaw suffered a mild stroke brought on by the effects of the altitude, and they were forced to withdraw to base camp at a critical stage. While Dick left the mountain, Chris would realize that he did not have the strength to return for a final climb. Thus, Pete and Joe were the expedition's final hope to conquer the 3 pinnacles. What made Pete and Joe so respected in the climbing community was not just their skill and accomplishments, but also their respect of the mountain. Throughout their careers, they had challenged themselves with some of the most difficult routes in the world, but as a pair, they had an uncanny ability to judge risk. During an interview after the Everest attempt, Chris would say about the pair, "They both possess great mountain judgment, and although bold and resolute in idea, were also prudently cautious." In mid-May, the pair would start the climb back up the mountain to the base of the first pinnacle, and on May 15th, they would begin the climb up the first incredibly steep ridge. Chris would watch the duo from below. They stood out amongst the dark rock and white snow as they wore bright red jackets. The evening of May 16th, Chris would receive a radio message from Pete and Joe that everything was smooth to this point and they were going to push on to the second pinnacle the following day. Once again, Chris would watch their progress on May 17th as they climbed the second ridge, and at approximately 9 p.m., they would pass over the peak to the far side of the second pinnacle, but this would be the last time anyone saw the pair alive. On May 18th, Chris and one of the support climbers, Adrian, would climb up the North Col in a prearranged plan to support Pete and Joe on their descent. They waited on the North Col, but there was no more sightings of the pair, and pretty soon it was clear that something had gone wrong. After 4 days, the 2 men descended the mountain and began studying the Kangshung face for clues, but they saw nothing. What exactly happened to the pair? To this day, it remains a mystery. They may have slipped and fallen, or succumbed to exhaustion during a bivouac. The reality is that we will never truly know. There was a huge search, including a long drive to the Karta Valley, but nothing was found. Charlie, one of the support climbers, chose a large slate near the 1924 memorial and chiseled a large epitaph. They placed the tablet and stood, silently, tearful, in the wind. The following day, they left to take the tragic news home. Charlie Clark later wrote, "I believe that with the mysteries of our personalities, our curious drivers, and our self-appointed goals, we would not have turned down this opportunity for fulfillment without denying ourselves a glimpse of the very meaning of existence. In time, I expect we shall do the same again and be lured back, perhaps, by another goddess, mother of the world." Writing about Pete and Joe, Charlie described his own sadness. "I was washed over by different waves of emotion. I fought with pain because I loved them. They were the personification of what I once wanted to be." Towards the end of that year, Hillary Boardman, Pete's wife, and Maria Coffey, Joe's partner, traveled to Everest. They were 2 strong women and decided to try in some way to feel that they were with Pete and Joe one last time. Maria wrote, "And as we began the drive to the north side of the Chomolungma, I was calm, almost happy. 2 eagles hovered high above us on the air currents. Joe and Pete, I thought, watching us leave. It was a fine place to spend eternity." Expeditions to the three Pinnacles in 1985, 1986, and 1987 would all fail to reach the high point that Pete and Joe reached. But in 1988, Russell Bryce and Harry Taylor would become the first men to successfully climb the three Pinnacles before descending the mountain via the North Ridge, as they were simply too exhausted to continue. The next expedition on the ridge in 1992 was a joint Japanese-Kazakh attempt, where they would find a body in a red jacket just beyond the second pinnacle at 8,200 meters. Pictures would be sent to Chris, and the body would be confirmed as Peter Boardman. Despite a few more attempts through the Pinnacles, Joe's body would never be found. I cannot understate the achievements these two men accomplished. Just a simple Google search will bring up countless expeditions and summits, and to me the most beautiful thing is after meeting each other in the 1970s, they always climbed together. Because of their dedication to writing, the Boardman Tasker Prize for Mountain Literature would be created in their honor, which provides financial support to one work each year that is an original work which has made an outstanding contribution to mountain literature. This story was special to me, and it is hard to put into words how much respect I have for the two men, along with being in awe of their accomplishments. I encourage anyone who would like to read the full account of the expedition to purchase Chris and Charlie's book, Everest, The Unclimbed Ridge. What just happened on Everest? We are in the middle of the 2023 Everest climbing season and have already seen multiple accidents occur on the world's tallest peak. Today we are going to cover all the events that took place, returning to the infamous Khumbu Icefall, along with further up on the mountain, where an American has unfortunately lost his life. This is their story. We have covered the Khumbu Icefall many times on this channel, and even recently on the events of 2014, but a couple of weeks ago in April, the deadliest part of Everest striked again, for the first time in 2023. 3 Sherpas have just lost their lives on the tallest peak of the world. The Icefall. An ever-shifting landscape of ice and rock, with large crevasses that would put a pit in your stomach and giant seracs hanging just above your head, warning you to not walk under them. There have been countless stories and tragedies within the Icefall, yet we always find ourselves back here, mainly because it is a necessary evil for anyone trying to summit Mount Everest from the south side, as traversing the ice is the only way to reach Camp 1 from base camp. Well, not the only way, but arguably the best way. Because climbers have to acclimatize to the mountain before making a summit push, they end up traversing the Icefall 5 to 7 times per season, while Sherpas can find themselves passing through the Icefall over 30 times. Acclimatizing is when someone would climb to a certain altitude on the mountain, typically one of the camps, where they would spend a specified amount of time there before descending back to base camp to rest. This is to allow their body to become accustomed to the lower levels of oxygen higher up on the mountain, strengthening themselves. But it also increases the time on the mountain, along with areas that you have to traverse, such as the Icefall. Steps have been taken to reduce the risk of the Icefall because the events in 2014, such as moving the route more towards the center, away from the edges that are more susceptible to falling ice, and while this does help to reduce some of the avalanche danger, there is simply no way to eliminate it all. On the morning of April 12, 2023, before the sun had risen, 3 Sherpas had set out on the Icefall. Lakpa Rita Sherpa, Pemba Tenjing Sherpa, and Dachiri Sherpa were all veterans of the Himalayas, having summited Everest many times. Their headlamps bounced off the snow and rock as they walked. They wanted to make it through the Icefall while it was at its coldest, just before sunrise. They were part of a 25-person team from Imagine, Nepal, assigned to fix the ropes between Camp 2 at 6,400 meters and the 8,849 meters summit of Everest. It is one of the most important jobs on the mountain, as without the ropes and high altitudes, nobody would be able to summit. They had been traversing the Icefall for some time. The sun had risen, and they were crossing the football field at 5,700 meters, a section of the Icefall that is directly in the center and one of the most exposed areas to falling seracs. At approximately 9:30 a.m., reports would start flowing in that an accident had occurred. It is unclear what exactly happened, as there are conflicting timelines. Garrett Madison, a leader of Madison Mountaineering, stated the accident was a collapse in the Khumbu Icefall. A hollow section of the glacier gave way and the ice around collapsed, according to his Sherpa team who were there at the time. The following day, this video showing an avalanche due to a serac collapsing on the west shoulder would surface, but is not yet clear if this was the cause of the accident or an event that occurred the following day. Ground rescue operations would start immediately after the reports came in, further supported by an aerial search, but due to worsening weather throughout the day and the risk of another avalanche, the rescue efforts were called off. While they generally knew the location of the three climbers and believed they had fallen approximately 50 meters into a crevasse before being buried by snow and ice, even if they were still alive, there was no way to help them. The accident would understandably slow the efforts on the mountain, as many mountaineers and families grieve the three Sherpas. But Mount Everest expeditions are a business, and as soon as an assessment of the icefall has taken place, the ice doctors would have to set up a new way through the dangerous crevasses. There would also have to be new high-altitude Sherpas who were willing to set up ropes further up on the mountain for the record-breaking numbers that were expected to climb Everest this year. But even after a few weeks, the movement would begin again, and climbers would still take their chances at summiting the world's tallest peak. Jonathan Sugarman was a 69-year-old retired doctor from Seattle who had always loved climbing when growing up, but had abandoned the sport in college due to the risks. In his 50s, he took a trip with a friend to Kilimanjaro and redeveloped his love for mountaineering. In 2016, while climbing Cho Oyu, the 6th tallest peak in the world, he suffered from altitude sickness and would have to abandon his attempt. But Jonathan couldn't give up on his dream, as he hired Uphill Athlete, a fitness training company, to help him with his endurance, particularly at higher altitudes. His new training regime worked, as he was able to summit Aconcagua in Argentina, Denali in Alaska, and Cotopaxi in Ecuador over the next few years in anticipation for his ultimate goal, Everest. In 2023, he traveled to the mountain early in the year with Washington-based International Mountain Guides, where they planned to acclimatize for a month and a half before looking for an open window in late May or June to attempt a summit, depending on weather conditions. Jonathan had worked with the company for over 3 years and had developed relationships with the guides and Sherpas. And when they arrived at base camp, Jonathan had brought his plastic trumpet to practice and cheered up those around him, as he was known to be a whimsical and outgoing guy. After arriving at base camp, they started climbing neighboring peaks in the Himalayas to acclimatize, but soon moved to Everest itself. And in the last few days of April, the team would wake up in the early hours of the morning at base camp and begin the trek through the Khumbu Icefall, where 3 Sherpas had lost their lives just a few weeks prior. The route had been re-established, and they were eager to get higher up on the mountain, as they were planning on spending the night in Camp 2 before touching Camp 3, turning around and descending back to base camp. This was supposed to be a routine acclimatization trip, one that is very common for anyone on Everest, but after making it to Camp 2 at approximately 21,300 feet, Jonathan fell ill. It's unclear yet how he felt during the climb to Camp 2, but we do know that it was an altitude-related sickness, and it came down on him quickly and hard. Unfortunately, the American passed away the following day on Monday, May 1st, 2023. His daughter would state that in every climbing party, he was the steady voice, administering equal amounts of advice for health and life. The tributes and support are truly touching, and will be linked below for anyone interested. With a record number of permits issued of 463 this year, it is hard to imagine there won't be another accident, and in fact at the time of this recording, there have already been more deaths on Everest, even after positive reports of good weather expected later this month. While we can hope there will be many successful summits and fewer accidents, but as we have just seen recently, on a mountain like Everest, it is not just the weather a climber has to be prepared for. The 2023 climbing season has been deadly. We are seeing many news articles break about different expeditions on Everest experiencing challenges, and the first week of Annapurna 1 was no different. Known for having one of the highest fatality rates of all 8,000ers, the 10th tallest peak in the world is infamous for its avalanches and hidden crevasses. Famous Ireland climber Noel Hanna, who has successfully summited Everest over 10 times, is among the first climbers to push for the summit of Annapurna, as well as 2 Indian climbers, Anurag Malu and Baljit Kaur, that have gone missing on the peak. Our story today covers the first week of the 2023 season on Annapurna 1, and the hardship each mountaineer faced. Up until recently, Annapurna 1 had the highest fatality rate for all 8,000ers. Although K2 has taken that title, that doesn't change the fact of how deadly the 10th tallest peak in the world is. With its natural steep climbing walls, the mountain is more susceptible to avalanches and unpredictable weather. Hidden crevasses lay dormant until an unsuspecting climber takes one wrong step. It's not as popular to climb as Everest, but it is truly reserved for those with bravery and mastery of their skill. Noel Hanna was exactly that man. At the age of 56, there was little the Ireland climber had not seen. He had successfully climbed Everest over 10 times, reached the highest point in the world on all 7 continents, and became the first Ireland climber to summit and descend K2. Noel would become the first Northern Ireland climber to summit Monaslu without supplemental oxygen, and in 2017, while accompanied by 3 Sherpas, they became the first men to summit Burt Kong, which borders Nepal and Tibet. Many had come before them and failed, but Noel and his team were the ones to etch their names in the history books. While his accomplishments are vast, it is safe to say he truly loved the sport. The start of any climbing season is always exciting, as guides and event planners try to time the best summit window months in advance. For Annapurna 1, the middle of April marked when most climbers would be attempting to make a push for the top. At base camp, there were 18 climbers, including Noel, gearing up for the start of the season. Despite being 56, he felt healthy enough to plan another expedition, and what better way to kick off the season by attempting an 8,000er. On April 16th, Noel was stationed at Camp 4, just 200 meters under the summit. He was accompanied by Naila Kiani and Shiroze Kashif from Pakistan and Ku Sui Chow from Singapore. It was not until 7 p.m. that all 4 climbers left to reach the summit together. As they climbed, the group passed fellow Indian climber Anurag Malu and his team who were returning after just reaching the peak. They shared some encouraging pats on the back and a thumbs up as the 2 groups crossed paths. Hours and hours went by as Noel and his team spent all night climbing Annapurna. The progress was slow, but they were very intentional with their movements. To reach the summit, the men would consistently have to climb through waist-high snow that is ever-changing around them due to being on a steep incline. There would be little to no flat areas to rest on, as your legs are pleading for a break. At 7:30 a.m., while the sun was rising on the horizon, the team finally eclipsed the high point and reached the summit of the deadly mountain. Noel felt exhausted and knew they still had to descend. But there is no other feeling like reaching a summit. That moment in time is special. After spending a few minutes up there, the 4 climbers took a break, gathered themselves mentally, and began their descent. They had been climbing for just over 12 hours at this point, so on the way down, they did not remain as a group. Instead, they all descended at their own pace. It was the perfect day to climb, as there were no weather conditions. None of the men were in a rush, and Noel particularly was slow to descend. His goal was just to reach Camp 4 before the sun set and settle in for the night before descending to base camp the following day. Although, as the day progressed, Noel started to realize just how exhausted he was. He would have to take one step to descend, following by resting a few minutes, and then repeating the process. As you can imagine, taking one step every few minutes is not ideal, and Noel would not reach Camp 4 until 7 p.m. that night. Arjun Vajpayee, a fellow climber that had also reached the summit the same day, saw Noel walk into camp. He reports that Noel was too exhausted to talk much, but seemed to be aware of himself and his surroundings. He would make himself a bowl of hot soup before zipping up his tent and turning in for the night. The next morning, Arjun woke up and began checking on all the climbers at Camp 4, and once he made it to Noel's tent, he could instantly tell that something was wrong. For one, Noel was unresponsive to any call-out. There had been no noises or movement made inside for hours. Arjun unzipped the tent from the outside and peeked inside, and the first thing he saw was a body laying in a sleeping bag, deathly silent. It didn't take him long to realize that Noel had unfortunately passed away. Feeling crushed as the mood at camp instantly soured, Arjun radioed down to base camp to pass on the news of what had happened. After being discovered, a team of Sherpas were put together to bring Noel's body down the mountain to be airlifted to Kathmandu and later transported to his family. His cause of death was believed to be altitude-related exhaustion, as his body simply had no energy left after climbing for a little under 24 total hours. Although Noel had just passed from climbing Annapurna, there were 2 climbers that he passed on his descent, still lost on the mountain and fighting for their lives. Baljit Kaur, an Indian climber that also successfully reached the summit on April 17th, but had gone missing near Camp 4 while descending solo from the summit. Her Sherpa that had been contracted for the trip received a better offer from a different foreigner, so he never actually climbed the mountain with her. Instead, he left her in Kathmandu to fend for herself. Baljit was instead led by an inexperienced porter and would meet up with an experienced Sherpa later. Unfortunately, they would meet the Sherpa just under the summit at Camp 4, after he had just finished an expedition on the peak and had not slept for over 24 hours. The plan was not appealing to Baljit, but nevertheless, on July 17th, the same day Noel summited, the 3 were stationed at Camp 4, ready to push for the peak. They had spent the entire previous day climbing with little rest, so their bodies were already feeling the toll on the mountain. And honestly, it went pretty much as expected. The 3 successfully reached the top towards the end of the day, but by this time, Baljit's mind and body had reached its limits. She began hallucinating as altitude sickness began to take over. The 3 climbers quickly turned around and started their descent in the night, but just like Baljit, her porter and Sherpa were also at their limits. All 3 climbers were experiencing altitude-related sickness, and it was becoming harder and harder to provide help to each other. Baljit was clearly in the worst shape out of the 3, and given everyone's condition, they agreed the Sherpa would go on ahead for help. After an hour or 2 of Baljit and her porter descending together, little progress had been made, and the porter was growing impatient. Eventually, he too would go on ahead with the plan of sending someone back to help Baljit. Hours would pass as night became day. Baljit lay there, alone on the mountain, slapping her face in an attempt to keep herself awake, her mind playing tricks on her. She had been on the mountain for over 36 hours, and climbing for the past 16 hours, so her body was heavily exposed to the conditions. After Baljit did not make it back to camp, the overall consensus was that something negative had happened to her. The men at base camp organized an aerial surveillance mission in an attempt to confirm her whereabouts and hopefully find her alive. Once the helicopter was in the air, Baljit was spotted on a familiar route, and a Sherpa would quickly climb to her location to assist her on the descent. It would take around 7 hours, but they successfully made it back to base camp without any issues. Our last climber, Anurag Malu, also an Indian climber that was on Annapurna the same day Noel reached the summit. Although, while Noel was making a bid for the top, Anurag was descending from about 5,800 meters on the mountain to base camp. Similar to Baljit, he was also descending alone, and due to the good weather, was a bit more relaxed than usual. Unfortunately, as Anurag took a step forward, the snow underneath him parted ways to reveal a hidden crevasse. But it was too late. He would fall into the ice. Luckily, his body stopped after landing on a ledge that was protruding. It was just enough to wedge his body from falling further, but the initial drop was brutal. The shock knocked Anurag out at the time, and his body sustained major injuries. The men back at base camp knew something was off when Anurag would not answer any radio calls and failed to make it back to camp for his check-in. A search and rescue team was put together and began searching for him at his last known location. Helicopters would fly above and attempt to spot anything while Sherpas covered the area on foot. The search would go on for 3 days straight with no signs of Anurag anywhere. Many already believed he was dead, and the search would most likely have not gone on very much longer. On April 20th, 3 days after the fall, a Polish climber by the name of Adam Bilecki was scrounging the area when he stumbled across a huge crevasse. Inside and barely noticeable was a faint red color of a hat that was almost completely covered by snow. Once Adam realized that he had found Anurag, a rescue team was put together, and they began the difficult task of raising him out of the hole. A team of elite climbers worked for hours, using different ropes and a leverage system, until eventually Anurag was free from his hell. He was transported by helicopter to receive further medical treatment in Kathmandu, and from there was flown back to India, where a slow, painful, but full recovery is being made. The first week of the 2023 climbing season on Annapurna 1 came with many hardships. 3 climbers particularly fell victim to the dangers an 8,000er can provide. 2 of those 3 were lucky to leave with their lives. Noel Hanna died doing what he has always done, climbing mountains. He knew the risks and understood the dangers on Annapurna, and yet he still wanted the challenge. He leaves behind a legacy that any mountaineer would be proud of. The 1995 K2 disaster was caused by one of the worst storms in the mountain's history. 7 climbers ended up losing their lives. Peter Hillary, a survivor of the storm, describes it best. What would it have been like up there? Imagine yourself in a large commercial freezer. It's minus 40 degrees. There's a 747 engine at one end of the freezer, blasting freezing air at you at 300, perhaps 400 kilometers per hour. Tilt the entire freezer on a 50-degree angle so that you are clawing with your ice axes and the crampons on your boots to secure purchase. Bear in mind that over 8,000 meters there is less than 1/3 the amount of oxygen in the air as at sea level, and your lungs are heavy with a wild rate of hyperventilation that is only sufficient to enable you to move at a snail's pace. Your circulation is impaired by the acclimatization process, and the cold is eating into your toes and fingertips. Now turn off the lights. That is what it is like on K2. Jeff Lakes was born in the city of Trail, which is located in British Columbia, Canada. At the age of 18, he would begin his climbing journey, as most do, by rock climbing anything and everything near his own town. The next 15 years of his life were spent climbing. Not only did he become an experienced mountaineer, he also became a very good ice climber and a talented photographer. His talents allowed him to be featured in many outdoor magazines as he traveled the world climbing various peaks. Jeff was overall very well liked in the community and was often seen giving lessons to kids in his free time. He is described as a thin man with a full head of hair, a mustache, and a smirk that seemed to be frozen onto his face. Jeff was unmarried and was known to be a loner, and like many professional climbers, his travel schedule and lifestyle made it hard to find a partner. But that was fine because his life was climbing, and eventually his skills would lead him to desire more. To climb peaks that few will ever say they have. And what better mountain to do that than K2? In 1993, Jeff joined a Dutch expedition that would travel to Pakistan and reach K2. However, this expedition was unsuccessful due to constant storms on the peak, but that did not deter Jeff in the slightest. In 1995, an opportunity arose again for him to be a part of a New Zealand team attempting to climb K2. At the time, there were already multiple expeditions stationed on the mountain, desperate to get their own shot at making history. Most notably, British mountaineer Alison Hargreaves, American climber Rob Slater, and many others. Unfortunately, the month of July did not provide a timing window to climb the mountain, as the weather was consistently poor. Jeff and company were desperately waiting, hoping that there would be a window in August. Otherwise, he would end up going back home without an attempt. The start of August brought calmer weather, and thus progress had begun to be made on the mountain. Different expeditions would climb up to the various camps, securing lines and gear. The American expedition that featured Alison Hargreaves started their climb on August 6th, and would be prepared for a summit push by August 9th. Jeff, the New Zealand expedition, and a Spanish expedition were all following close behind on their own routes. The Spanish expedition would actually establish Camp 4 at 7,950 meters, or 26,082 feet. It was at this location that Alison and Rob Slater would find the Spaniards. They would also be joined by Jeff Lake and 2 other climbers of the New Zealand expedition. All of them agreed that they would attempt to reach the summit together early the next morning. Once each individual had their share of conversations, the different expeditions separated for the night to go to their own camps and rest. The next morning, August 13th, 4 members of the Spanish expedition, Lorenzo Ortiz, Javier Olivar, Javier Escartin, and Jose Garces, left for the summit, assuming that the other mountaineers would catch up to them. An hour later, at 1 a.m., Slater, Hargreaves, and a New Zealander climber named Bruce Grant would pass the Spaniards' campsite and eventually catch up to the group. They passed Jose on the way up, as he could not climb further due to his feet deteriorating. Back at camp, Jeff and a fellow companion, Peter Hillary, did not seem to be in a rush. In fact, they actually took their time climbing K2. The pair did not start the summit push until about 9 a.m., although Peter really had no intention of climbing past the bottleneck. His goal was more or less to document and take pictures of their journey, not reach the summit. Once the pair reached the bottleneck, they sat down to rest, Not really feeling the urge to continue, Jeff and Peter watched as the climbers above them slowly made progress. From below, the group did not look to be in good shape. Most of them were either sitting down or laying against the ice, only taking a step forward just to rest again. Allison, wanting to be encouraging, was heard shouting, "Come on up," to Jeff and Peter. Another 10 minutes passed, and Peter noticed a dark cloud in the distance. He had a bad feeling, and Peter himself will attest that he heard a small voice telling him to go down, and with that, his mind was made up. He communicated his intentions to Jeff, but honestly, Jeff wanted to wait a little bit longer before making his decision. Peter handed Jeff his radio, wished him luck, and started to descend, not knowing this would be the last time that he saw Jeff alive. Jeff would ultimately decide to go for the summit. As he began to traverse the bottleneck, unknown to those on the peak, warm, moist air was traveling up from the valley floor from the south side of the peak, about to collide with an anticyclone, which meant that there would be large-scale circulation of air that would lead to unimaginable wind strength about to hit the mountain. In short, a massive and deadly storm was coming fast. Peter, descending the mountain, was the first to be hit. The storm was so strong, it literally lifted Peter off the ground and flung him against some rocks. He would spend the next 2 hours battling the conditions in an attempt to save his own life. Jeff reached the summit around the time the storm hit Peter, which was about 6 p.m. Jeff could tell that something was wrong below him, but he was too high up on the mountain for the winds to reach him, although his mind began to drift towards the 6 climbers he passed to reach the summit, as they had started their descent hours ago. Despite the troubling thoughts, it was hard not to appreciate the beauty of K2 from where Jeff stood. He felt on top of the world, but like all that summit a peak, Jeff knew that his journey was only halfway over. Once he started his descent, it did not take long to notice that the weather was deteriorating around him. Visibility began dropping rapidly as it was harder to see where to step. He was nervous, but knew to keep a level head, and the fixed lines that were used to ascend the mountain were still intact, so at least there was a guideline to help him traverse down from the summit. After what felt like ages, Jeff finally stumbled into the site where Camp 4 had been established, right around 8,000 meters. He almost walked right by the location, but stopped himself and took a closer look around. What he saw terrified him. The campsite was no longer there. It had been destroyed by an avalanche, and to make matters worse, the sun was setting on the horizon, meaning Jeff would be surrounded by darkness in just a few minutes. A quick but potentially life-altering decision had to be made: to continue the descent in darkness, or to settle in for the night with whatever shelter he could find. Jeff decided that he would take his chances and stay put. He managed to make a small makeshift tent with the supplies he had left, but it did not provide much shelter from the conditions. The hours went painfully slow, and to Jeff, it was like watching paint dry as he sat there alone, unable to sleep, his mind wondering what happened to the other climbers that also had descended from the summit. Suddenly there was a loud and terrible roar as the mountain groaned, warning those on its slopes. Snow began to fall on Jeff when all of a sudden, he was completely buried. He had enough room to maneuver and began digging himself out of the snow, cursing at the mountain. He had been struck by an avalanche. Once he was free, Jeff gathered himself and assessed the gear he had left. Unfortunately, the avalanche caused him to lose his ice axe and crampons, which put him in a difficult situation. He couldn't believe his luck. Here he was, 8,000 meters on K2, now without the proper gear to climb a small mountain, let alone the Savage Mountain. Given the situation, he knew he was in trouble, but at the same time tried not to think about it too much. His mind began to settle on just one thought: survive. The night had mostly passed at this point, and Jeff could not sleep, so he did the only thing he could: descend the mountain. Camps 3 and 2 were thousands of meters below him, and the progress was slow. The weather was not as violent when the storm first hit, but the wind was still not calm. As Jeff climbed, it was hard not to feel hopeless. He was upset with himself for not securing his crampons better, and he couldn't shake the thought of Hargreaves or the others. But ultimately, Jeff stayed disciplined. He refused to accept defeat and was determined to make it back to Camp 2. All day he climbed, fighting against his negative thoughts, until he finally reached Camp 2 towards the end of the day. Jeff called out for help as he had no strength left, and just as he collapsed on the ground, the zipper on a tent could be heard as the figure of a man stepped out. The men stationed at Camp 2 couldn't believe it. They thought everyone had died in the avalanche and did not see how Jeff could have survived the wind speeds up to 180 miles per hour. It just didn't make sense. Yet there he was. Jeff was close to death, but in the moment, he never felt more alive. He cried tears of joy and could be heard saying how happy he was that he successfully summited K2 and returned. It was his goal and a pinnacle moment in his life that would define what he thought of himself. Deep down, he knew he had done it. He did not regret his decision, knowing that something extraordinary was just accomplished. Once Jeff was comfortable, all the men fell asleep for the night. It did not take long for the good mood at camp to shift, as Jeff would never wake up from his slumber. He slipped into the void shortly after falling asleep. It was noted to have been caused from a mixture of things: exhaustion, heart failure due to altitude-thickened blood, and just his overall condition having to fight the storm. He quite literally used every ounce of strength in his body. I know the story does not end on a positive note, but the 1995 K2 disaster was a brutal event that took the lives of 7 mountaineers. The storm was so powerful that the climbers not with Jeff were quite literally thrown off the mountain. Although I have to acknowledge the fight Jeff had in him. He never gave up and will be remembered in such an incredible way. He did not have a wife or kids, did not really have many hobbies, but what he did have, he gave everything for: climbing, and you have to respect that. The death toll on Everest has hit double digits in 2023, already marking it as one of the deadliest years on the mountain. Over the last 50 years, the average deaths per year on Mount Everest is approximately 5, but we are more than double that number this year. With over 600 climbers reaching the summit, the number of climbers on the mountain continues to rise as the world views Everest as more of a tourist attraction rather than the deadly mountain it is. But if you mess with the mountain, you may never return home. 2 more families are stuck with the reality that their loved ones are not coming off the tallest peak in the world. This is their story. Mount Everest has an issue. There are simply too many people on the mountain at any one point in time, and we are seeing the effects of this. There is a record number of traffic, supplies, and human waste being left behind, and 13 climbers have lost their lives on the mountain this year. Nepal issued 478 permits to 47 teams, and with 1.5 Sherpas assisting each climber, this is over 1,200 people on the mountain. A record number. This is mainly to uphold their economy as they rely heavily on the income generated by climbers willing to spend thousands to have a chance of reaching the tallest point on Earth. Not only permit fees, but also the revenue generated for Sherpas, hotels, taxis, and vendors on the street. We can all agree that many of these people rely on the income from climbers, and don't get me started on the pay of Sherpas. So it seems like a necessary evil. But what can we do to reduce the risk of the mountain, and maybe more importantly, take care of Mother Nature? Well, there are initiatives to clean the mountain, such as the Nepal Army Mountain Cleanup Campaign. But we saw this year one of the Sherpas, a part of this initiative, sadly passed away on May 16th. The reality is that the permits are only increasing, and this means more people who are not ready to climb Everest will be testing their luck, not only increasing the risk for themselves, but also those that are ready and trying to achieve a lifelong dream. Dr. Peter Swart was an anesthesiologist from Canada who was ready to fulfill his goal of reaching the highest point in the world. Peter, originally from South Africa, had started climbing at the age of 9, and since then grew up with the desire of taking on Everest. While Peter developed a love for climbing at an early age, it would take a back seat to his career and family. But after graduating medical school in South Africa, moving to Canada, creating a successful anesthesiology practice, marrying the love of his life Saritha, and becoming a father of 2, he would once again find an unquenchable thirst to climb. After years of training, in 2019, at the age of 59, Peter would take on the tallest peak in North America, Denali. He would successfully summit the 6,190.5 meter peak and celebrate one of the greatest moments of his life. But the thirst would continue as Peter would move his sights to Everest. He would decide to make the trip to Everest with Madison Mountaineering. You may have heard the name once or twice if you have seen some of my other videos, as they are one of the most popular mountain services. Of course, Peter would be climbing up the southeast route through Nepal and be following the usual acclimatization schedule, which consisted of multiple trips on the mountain, each time reaching a higher point, spending some time at the higher altitude, and then descending back to base camp to rest. This photo, taken by legendary climber Garrett Madison, showed Peter on April 28th traversing through the Khumbu Icefall on one of these acclimatization trips. And on May 16th, Peter would post his own photo to his own Instagram of him once again traversing the icefall for the final time, as they were beginning to make a summit push. The caption would read, "Ice climbing in the Khumbu Icefall today. Perfect day." The climb up the mountain would be pretty standard, and the team would arrive at Camp 4 just under the death zone at 7,950 meters without incident. They would be preparing for the final summit push, and this is where the details get a little fuzzy. It is not clear if Peter did summit, but after entering the death zone, he would begin to develop a dry cough that others would notice, and because of the altitude, he would quickly develop respiratory issues. We all know the dangers of the death zone, where the oxygen is a third of what it is at sea level, but trying to climb the world's tallest peak with respiratory issues, well, it's not a good combo. Peter would have to descend the mountain, but his condition would only worsen to the point where his body could barely function. After traversing back to Camp 4 and on the descent to Camp 3 at 7,300 meters, just before reaching the safety of the tents, Peter's body would unfortunately collapse. The 63-year-old would pass away soon after. The outpour of support from family and friends would soon follow, with a colleague of Peter describing, "Peter's sense of humor was second to none. Laughing was always part of the encounter, and you always parted smiling. He was a trusted friend to many." I don't believe Peter's story is one of a climber not ready to take on Everest, but more so the unfortunate reality that you can prepare your entire life, and sometimes Mother Nature just doesn't care. But Peter would die chasing a dream, and there are a lot worse ways to go. Jason Kennison's story to reach Everest was vastly different from Peter. In fact, he was never even supposed to have made it to Everest, but the 40-year-old wanted to summit the world's tallest peak for charity after a disaster struck in 2006. Jason would be involved in a serious truck crash that would leave him with a broken leg, damaged shoulders, and after a routine operation, he would suffer from spinal cord damage. This would cause him to be stuck in a wheelchair. Doctors told him that he may never walk again, but Jason would begin rehab immediately, and within months, there would be a significant improvement in his condition. He would have to relearn how to walk, and that's exactly what he did. A year after his injury, he would return back to work in the mines, but it would take years before he was fully healed, and he never would be the same mentally. Well, I think Jason could describe it best.
Looking back, it took a lot of my confidence, my self-esteem. I think each injury that I had, and that really affected, I guess, made me a bit more insecure.
He wanted to climb Everest, not only because it was a dream of his, but to show that he could, and to raise awareness around spinal cord injuries. He should have never even made it to the mountain, but the fact that he did was an achievement within itself. In 2023, I will head to Nepal to see and be on Mount Everest, a long way from once battling traumatic injuries and the low and dark days of depression, an ambitious feat that I would never have dreamed of or thought was possible after once being told that I would not be able to walk. I'm going to make the most of my life, and part of that involves helping other people who have had their life changed in an instant through spinal cord injury. They shouldn't be forgotten. They should be helped. Jason would be climbing with Asian trekking, and had prepared by setting up a ladder in his backyard to become comfortable with traversing on the rungs. He would also travel to New Zealand before the expedition to practice rock climbing and altitude climbing. Similar to our first story, Jason would have no issues acclimatizing to the mountain, and in late May there was predicted to be a clear weather window to which the group would finally prepare for the summit push. After making their way through the Khumbu Icefall and up the mountain to the various camps, Jason felt good. His body was strong from all the training and preparation. This video of Jason shows him just above Camp 2, making his way up the mountain. They would make it to Camp 4 just under the death zone on May 18th, and like most climbers, get a small amount of rest before making the final push in the early hours of the morning. Jason would stand on the roof of the world on May 19th, once again proving just how much grit and determination he had, along with being an inspiration for so many. But as we all know, reaching the top of Everest is only half the battle. On the descent, Jason began showing some concerning symptoms, mainly around hallucination and confusion. To make matters worse, the two Sherpas that were with Jason were running out of oxygen canisters. Now, it is unclear if they were out of oxygen because of a lack of planning, or if their pace was just too slow, but this would only spiral Jason's condition. And shortly after reaching the balcony, one of the more difficult areas on the mountain, Jason would begin to refuse to climb. He was suffering from high-altitude cerebral edema, or HACE, a condition in which the brain swells from a lack of oxygen, causing irrational behaviors and thoughts, until ultimately the body begins to shut down. The two Sherpas would make the decision to return to Camp 4 ahead of Jason to retrieve more oxygen canisters before returning back to him. But because of a quick change in the weather while the Sherpas were at Camp 4, a climb back up to Jason was impossible. Unfortunately, Jason would collapse just above the balcony at 8,500 meters and would sadly take his final breath. Like most climbers who would sadly perish in the death zone, nobody would be able to retrieve Jason's body, a sad reality that all climbers must face, forever being trapped above 8,000 meters. Jason's family would put out some touching comments, with his mother remembering her final words to her son, and I said, "Well, just remember, Jason, please take it easy. Take care, and remember, I'll always love you." And that was the last words we said. It's hard to deny his accomplishments, and even Jason's brother, Adrian, would state he made it in high spirits, doing what he wanted. There was the climb up, he had his photo on top of the summit. I do believe there's no denying that Jason achieved exactly what he wanted to. This season left many professionals on the outside fearful that we would have deja vu of 2019, with long lines of climbers seeking to reach the summit. But even with record numbers of climbers, we just didn't see this, mainly in part to the colder weather that sent a higher number of climbers home mid-season, many with a persistent virus that was traveling around camps. But the reality still remains that there are more climbers on the mountain than ever before, and with that comes risks. There is no denying the rise in deaths, making it one of the deadliest seasons in the mountain's history. But the question still remains, what is next for the king of all mountains?